competing with the choir next door reminds me of a time I once went to a national clean air conference talking about what was a serious problem in Oregon of urban air pollution caused by residential wood stoves. And down the hallway there was a seminar, a slideshow on preserving visibility in the Grand Canyon. And nobody came to my session, and everybody went down to the Grand Canyon session. So eventually I folded up shop and went down and did the same. I was talking to one of the women at the break next door. I said, well, you know, if things get a little too slow in over here, maybe we'll come over and listen to you. And she said, yeah, just poke your head in the door, come on in. So, I'm going to talk about the role of automobiles and the American dream in the context of, especially for poor folks, something that I'm starting to spend some time on, promoting low-income car ownership. A couple of years ago, there was a study produced by the STPP, and one of the comments in there was that, quote, nearly 95% of transportation spending by the poorest households is devoted to private vehicle expense, and that this, quote, inhibits wealth creation. So, like many STPP studies, they managed to get it exactly wrong, which is that if you're poor, and especially if you're unemployed, but you'd like to be working, having access to or owning an automobile is a very key part of wealth creation for yourself, is not inhibiting wealth creation. Now, I was not really, well, I would have intuitively guessed this any number of years ago, but it didn't really hit me in a bold face until I went to, there's a weekly series of brown bag seminars at Portland State put on by some of the academics there, and so there was a master's student, Carrie Sullivan, who was presenting her thesis 2 years ago about auto ownership and low-income folks, and her thesis in particular, she had some data tracking adults in Portland who did not have a high school diploma or a GED, and then she analyzed their employment patterns and found that those who owned a car or had access to a private car were 80% more likely to be employed. They worked about 8.5 weeks more per year than those who were transit dependent, and their weekly pay was $275 higher per week than the transit dependent group. She found that having a GED or high school diploma played no significant role in explaining these differences, and that car ownership was a much better predictor of employment. And I'm sitting there listening to this, and she said, by the way, this is pretty consistent with the other literature. Well, literature that I hadn't really actually tried to track down, or that I wasn't even sure existed, but I was kind of stunned listening to this, contemplating the fact that we, at this time, were in the midst of spending $60 million per mile to cannibalize road space on a 4-lane arterial in North Portland, downsize it to 2 lanes so we could build light rail to replace a perfectly functioning bus line. Thinking, wow, $60 million a mile, car ownership, you know, I think there's something to this. I got to check this out. And so my initial thought was that this is really good news, that if, in fact, for a high school dropout who's job searching and who was trying to get their life together, it would actually be cheaper to help them get a used car and some insurance and get a job than it would be to subsidize them to go back to school. Although it's a lot easier to do the car thing than the education thing, so in one sense that's good news. But of course in Portland this would not be considered good news for the very reason that the previous speaker mentioned, that we have the Congestion Coalition, whose goal is to make driving as expensive and miserable as possible through all the techniques that most of you in the room know. That one of the favorites in Portland, of course, is to downsize a highly used and valued 4-lane arterial to 2 lanes. They've done this several times, where there already is a very useful bus line. In fact, our most recent one, if it was privatized to get it out of the clutches of the massively overcompensated and underproductive TriMet staff, it would actually be a profitable bus line. That bus line was replaced with this massively wasteful light rail line at $60 million a mile, and now we have an increase in traffic congestion in North Portland, which I guess for the planner crowd, this is the trifecta of policy victory, that they made congestion worse, they wasted a lot of money, and they replaced a perfectly usable bus line with a silly light rail line. Well, then we also shrink roads for bikeways and monster sidewalks. I've actually stood next to front-end loaders ripping out really nice, flat 6-foot sidewalks to be later replaced with 10-foot sidewalks for the pedestrians that only existed in the imagination of planners. And this helped downsize the arterials. This, I believe, Kathleen, that's one of your traffic calming strategies, I believe. Cutting edge in Portland, yes. Millions of dollars of flex funds, that is gas tax money, laundered through Washington, D.C. and sent back to Portland for this purpose of making motorists' lives more miserable. And then, of course, we routinely increase parking prices in Portland to subsidize the streetcar. We restrict parking, put traffic signals in to benefit light rail at the expense of traffic synchronization, as was discussed on the field trip. And then we have lots of congestion-inducing transit-oriented developments in Portland that are subsidized by taxpayers. And for those of you who've read James Dunn's book, Driving Forces, he refers to this coalition as the anti-auto vanguard, whose members view automobiles not as a proud achievement of American industry, but as a relentless oppressor and a menace to civilization. And I'm sure you all run into those folks. Now, now for me as a lifelong transit user of all types, I like Randall, I have a preference for trains. Unfortunately, trains don't make sense in very many places, but I like them when I can find them, if they do make sense. But notwithstanding this, I mean, there is this problem of the spatial mismatch, a phrase first, I think, coined by the eminent transportation economist John Kane back in the 1960s, talking about the issue of poor and frequently minority populations living in central cities, while jobs had been following housing and dispersing across the landscape, creating a problem, this spatial mismatch problem between employment and housing. Well, there's a voluminous literature on the spatial mismatch hypothesis, but in general, I mean, we know there are some problems in that 2/3 roughly of new jobs are in the suburbs, but there are large pockets of low-income people in the cities, and the fact that about 3/4 of all welfare recipients live in central cities or the rural areas, and even, well, as the crow flies, they might only be 3, 4, 5, 8 miles from job markets, but if you're taking transit, and especially if you're taking transit for a night owl shift and you're a reverse commuter, a lot of that transit is simply going to be irrelevant to you because it's not going to where you want to go at the time you need to go, or it might get you there, but it leaves you stranded because it doesn't get you back home. Also, it doesn't really help you with the trip chaining problem, which is that many of us take a trip to one place and then chain several errands along the way, and that's just difficult to do with transit, especially if you've got kids. Most welfare recipients live within about a 1/4 mile of transit, but again, so what? Just because you live to transit, close to transit, doesn't mean that the service is very relevant to your life. In the bottom 25% of the income distribution, about 38% of households have no car, and only about 10 and 25% of welfare recipients own cars. So the people who need the help the most, they're the ones who are most transit dependent, and there's just a big barrier to getting to work. And this is especially difficult for working women, because working women in urban areas have about 12% more trips than working men, and they have about 31% more trips per day than unemployed women. Dr. Sandra Rosenblum from the University of Arizona, who's an expert on women and their transportation habits, she comments that working women with children are particularly dependent on the car because it is the best and perhaps only way to balance childcare and domestic responsibilities they retain when they enter the paid labor force. Well, fortunately, there is this new scholarship that's emerging, most of it just in the last 10 to 15 years, showing not only a correlation, but increasingly an empirical link between automobile ownership, income, and employment. And Steve Raphael of Berkeley is one of the leading scholars in this field. He's done a lot of work looking at these links and finds in one of his papers, especially looking at the relationship between the black-white unemployment gap and car ownership, he and a co-author that raising the minority car ownership rates to the car ownership rate for whites would narrow the black-white unemployment rate differential by 43% and the comparable Latino-white differential by 17%. There are other studies that point to the same conclusion in Milwaukee, Boston, Los Angeles, that if you're trying to increase income in households and promote a lower unemployment rate, car ownership, or at least access to private car is critical. Now, what's been the policy response from the government? Well, in the last federal transportation law, there was acknowledgement of this problem, and they put in a section that's called the JARC, Job Access Reverse Commute, recognizing that if you're in the city and you're commuting out to the burbs in the morning, a lot of the bus service is not even operating in your direction, it's operating inbound. But as they created a pot of money, I think $750 million over 3 years or 4 years to implement this JARC program. But while I guess it was sort of well-intentioned, the lawmakers, especially pushed by environmental advocates, just could not bring themselves to actually help people get private automobiles. Looking at the list of the money is dispersed through competitive grants, and it runs basically through transit agencies or MPOs. And in Portland, in the most recent year, just as a little snapshot, which is pretty typical around the country, well, we got $80,000 to Portland for marketing the Interstate Max, which is light rail. Okay, no help there. $213,000 to South Area Rapid Transit in Wilsonville to increase bus service to Portland. Okay, well, that's traditional service. Now we got $155,000 to the Community Cycling Center for its Create a Commuter program. So social service clients are referred to it and are eligible for a free restored bicycle and all necessary safety gear after completing classes focusing on safety and general maintenance. I'm sure welfare moms are just beating a path to the door to get that new federal entitlement. Now, there also was a grant of $2,500 for non-commute taxi vouchers on contract to TriMet, our local monopoly transit provider. It's made available to social service agencies. So it's interesting that of all the money spent under the Job Access Reverse Commute program, the grant that comes closest to providing actual, door-to-door, private, on-demand service is this dinky little $2,500 voucher program for taxis, but it has to be for non-commute purposes, because we certainly wouldn't want to have, promote auto use to get to work and call it a job. That would be too politically incorrect. So, my view is that JARC program is pretty terminal. One paper I was reading noted that in Los Angeles there was a task force that was appointed to develop a transportation plan for welfare recipients, and they initially included a spending program that would be a loan or grant program to help low-income people, welfare recipients, get automobiles, but that was later eliminated by the Board of Supervisors. So that's pretty much the typical response. And as there's a growing number of authors publishing in this field. Margie Waller, who's with Brookings Institution, and I believe also affiliated with Progressive Policy Institute, has published a number of papers and notes that the most important response to the policy challenge of job access for those leaving welfare is the continued and expanded use of cars by low-income workers. But she then goes on to note that private automobiles have been an overlooked solution and remain largely taboo in Washington, D.C. and a number of states due to environmental opposition. So this is no big surprise that helping poor people get to work would be opposed by the Congestion Coalition. Fortunately, there is this growing movement, sort of a backlash against this, and it's being led, as far as I can tell, by a number of anti-poverty groups or groups that would consider themselves in some sense liberal or progressive, who recognize that every time you have people driving, you have the potential for congestion externalities or air pollution. But they also recognize the air pollution issue is declining, congestion is solvable, and in this case, a lot of these cars would be on at either reverse commutes or off hours, where their contribution to congestion would be minimal, and therefore we should not deal with this on the backs of people who need to be in cars. So there's a group called the National Economic Development and Law Center out of Oakland. They published a guide called Shifting into Gear that assesses a whole range of these of burgeoning number of car loan programs around the country. They have a web page. They have an e-newsletter that I subscribe to, which actually Margie Waller appears to write most or all of it from Brookings. And they find there's approximately 40 car loan or car ownership programs around the country, typically offering loans to eligible people to either maintain access to a car at a time when they're about to lose it, or to get a car. And clients, the car value is typically between $2,000 and $5,000. Clients pay either between $0 and $5,000, depending on a number of factors. And these are mostly loan programs. They're not too many giveaway programs, which is good from my standpoint. I think low interest or no interest loan programs provide an important sense of fiscal discipline and a sense of dignity for people, that they're not just getting a handout, they're getting an assistance to own an important asset. And they find out of these 40 programs around the country that, quote, early results show that car ownership leads to higher wages and decreased dependence on the government in other sources, that is food stamps, welfare, other things, decreased outlays in those programs. In Portland, well, there is no car loan program anywhere in Oregon, except that recently, about 3 months ago, a nonprofit charity called Metropolitan Family Service performed the almost impossible task of actually getting a couple $100,000 out of the feds, the transportation money, which I thought was actually illegal to take JARC money and use it for car loan program, but they managed to get money there, plus from some foundation money and free bank loan processing from a local bank. And they've hired a person, a gal from Chicago who just moved to Portland. She's really great. She's administering the program, and they're now in the process of administering what they expect about 60 loans this year that will mostly be to low-income single moms, either who need a car or whose car is about to be repoed because something happened in their life. And it doesn't take much if you're poor. Any change can be a catastrophic change when you have no savings. And so these will be her clients. And she's, as a newcomer to Portland, she's been fairly stunned at the response of people such as the elected members of Metro, our MPO, who have badgered her about what a bad idea this is, that people should just live closer to their jobs. And she's kind of astounded at why they're so hostile to poor people. But I said, well, that's welcome to Portland for you. As a side note, for those of you who have, I personally would like to see car loan programs expand, and we're talking about cars of the value of $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a car. But some of you may have seen the study last year by the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank looking at the St. Louis light rail program and concluding that you could give a new Toyota Prius and every 5 years for each poor rider and pay an annual maintenance cost of $6,000, and you would still have $49 million left over for other socially beneficial uses if you just stopped building light rail in St. Louis. And that's on the St. Louis Fed website. If you haven't seen the study, it's pretty amusing, and it's very straightforward. These are smart economists who just said, what if we took the light rail money and spent it on these cars? And of course, I would not propose to be doing car ownership programs involving brand new Toyotas. You can do it a lot cheaper than that. So what are the policy implications of all this? I would say, one, let's just accept the fact that there is this spatial mismatch, and there's always going to be that. Or as the previous speaker said, and as Wendell has said, sprawl's here, let's get over it, accept it. It's the way life is. and that even if you had a spatial match, that is, you miraculously had an apartment just 2 blocks from your job, there are other things in your life, shopping, kids, recreation. It's almost impossible to have all these things to be transit-oriented or within walking. So let's just accept the fact that that we're dispersed and cars help. Let's accept the fact that even if we had enough money to have gold-plated transit to run all around low-density suburbs, it's frankly not meeting the needs, especially of single parents. They need access to private cars when they want them and taking them where they go at a moment's notice. Let's try and deregulate the transit industry to legalize jitneys and other forms of on-demand transit, low-cost transit that can actually sort of mimic the benefits of cars. I think we should just pull the plug on JRC and try and divert those. If we're going to have those spending programs, let's divert them to a competitive type grant program where these 40 or so car income or low-income car loan programs might get some of that money in a competitive process and administer it in a fiscally disciplined kind of way. Or we require that a certain percentage of flexible funds that goes back to DC and comes back home, which is now diverted to transit boondoggles, let's divert some of that for these low-income car ownership programs. And if we do all that, I think what you'll find will be, unemployment rates will go down, household income for the poorest members will go up, spending on transit will go down because we'll have less spending on boondoggles, we'll have less money spent on welfare assistance because we'll have fewer people on welfare, and most importantly, I think the quality of life for those in the poorest sector of society will be improved immeasurably because owning a car is simply so empowering. Thanks.